The packed courtroom breathed like a theater. At the center stood a 12-year-old girl in a faded red sweater, her braid frizzed from restless sleep. She said why her mother had missed another hearing, and the words drew mockery. Polished shoes tapped in rhythm with laughter, cufflinks glittered like knives in sunlight. The judge leaned back, medals from his service glinting on the wall behind him, his disbelief heavier than the gavel. A poor child's truth collided with wealth-varnished arrogance, and the echo of chuckles clung to mahogany panels. Smartphones tilted upward, recording humiliation disguised as order. For the girl, each giggle was a nail. For the father beside her, each second cost another hour's wages borrowed for legal fees. The court smelled of polished wood and cologne, but the child smelled of school bus diesel. Laughter had currency here, and it was spent on her. Philadelphia County's courthouse was a stage carved from privilege. Mahogany stretched across walls polished so often they reflected faces in warped fragments. Chandeliers trembled faintly with the vibrations of shuffling papers and suppressed coughs. The air was thick with expensive perfumes and the faint burn of coffee poured from brass flasks brought by attorneys. On one side sat lawyers in tailored suits, the sheen of their fabric whispering money. On the other, a weary adjunct professor in a suit borrowed from a brother, cuffs too long, shoulders sagging from work that never paid. Between them, the girl sat still, her thrift sweater too bright in a room designed for neutral power. Dust floated where sunlight pierced through tall windows, each particle a silent reminder of forgotten generations judged beneath the same chandeliers. The courthouse was supposed to smell of justice, but it smelled of exclusion and quiet derision.
Judge Alistair Worthing entered with the gait of someone trained to command. His spine was unbent, his chin angled, his gaze sharpened from decades of naval discipline. On his robe's lapel, a miniature insignia gleamed discreetly but deliberately, a symbol of a past he carried into present rulings. He had once been toasted at donor dinners, introduced as the officer who brought his service into law. In chambers lined with plaques, he repeated stories of deployments to polite applause from wealthy friends who never wore boots in mud. To the courtroom, he carried more than law. He carried the authority of myth. That authority bore no patience for contradiction, especially from a child whose shoes squeaked secondhand against polished floors. His medals were invisible but loud, a background hum that overpowered the fragile voice in front of him. Here, authority weighed more than evidence. At the plaintiff's table sat the child's father, Ethan Quinn, a man whose academic dreams had withered into part-time teaching and late-night rideshare shifts. His suit jacket was pressed by a neighbor's iron, but no amount of steam erased years of strain on the fabric. Shoes scuffed from bus stops, tie frayed at the edges. He looked like a man paying for justice in coins instead of bills. Next to him, his daughter sat with shoulders squared, but her thrift store sweater betrayed the battle between pride and scarcity. A half-torn notebook peeked from her bag, paper corners curling as though it too had grown tired. Their poverty was not an argument filed in court. It was stitched into their clothes, written in the exhaustion around his eyes. Each sigh was a receipt unpaid. Each shuffle of papers another reminder that courtrooms measured wealth before they measured truth.
Around the girl's neck hung a compass pendant, its brass dulled by age, its chain slightly tarnished from countless hands clutching it. She traced its surface with fingers that had memorized more than cardinal points. Patterns formed in rhythm, unseen codes repeating silently like prayer. To others, it was a trinket, perhaps a keepsake from a thrift store. To her, it was a lifeline, a memory of nights when absence was soothed by ritual. The pendant gleamed faintly under courtroom light, and though no one noticed, each touch was a message unanswered. It was her mother's ghost carried openly in a room unwilling to believe. In laughter's shadow, the pendant stayed steady, its weight small but unyielding. If mahogany and marble belonged to the rich,
then brass and ritual belonged to her, an inheritance carved not in wealth, but in the discipline of secrecy. When asked why her mother was never present, the girl spoke with a steadiness rare for her age. She said her mother served where no one believed women could serve. The words settled first in silence, then detonated into smirks and suppressed chuckles. Some shook their heads, others leaned back, amused. The judge's expression stiffened, certainty etched across his features like stone carved by decades of training. He declared what he knew as fact, what the Navy's tradition had always told him. There were no women in that place. Laughter swelled again, cascading down polished walls, each chuckle a reminder of her poverty, each smirk a blade pressed lightly against her dignity. She stood against history, against arrogance, and the cost was humiliation she could neither escape nor explain. Her claim was impossible, and impossibility was entertainment for those with nothing to lose.
Before the courtroom, years of absence had already carved wounds. Birthdays marked by empty chairs, recitals played to one parent clapping alone, hospital nights warmed by neighbors instead of blood. Each moment the mother was gone was replaced not by explanations, but by thrift dinners and secondhand promises. The father stretched wages to cover not only food, but the silence left behind. For a child, absence was measured not in months, but in stories untold, questions unanswered, and secrets held too tightly. The courtroom painted absence as neglect, but poverty had already painted it as routine. Scarcity taught her patience, but it also taught her suspicion. When laughter met her claim, it was not just her mother they mocked. It was every day she had endured waiting at windows, hoping the shape turning the corner might belong to someone who could prove love with presence. The attorney opposing them approached with polished steps, voice dripping with sympathy rehearsed 100 times. Questions were crafted to frame the child as fanciful, the father as desperate, the absent mother as careless. The gallery leaned forward, savoring spectacle like theater. Each query tightened the rope of disbelief. Each leading suggestion cast her as naive. Her composure held, but her hands betrayed the tremor in her chest. The compass pendant traced its coded ritual, her last defense against humiliation swallowing her whole. Poverty gave her no shield, only resilience forged by necessity. To the wealthy, doubt was a tool. To her, doubt was an enemy she had lived with since infancy. And in that moment, the courtroom felt less like justice and more like a marketplace where ridicule was sold cheaply, and the poor were currency spent for laughter's brief reward.
Just as doubt seemed irreversible, the bailiff leaned close to the judge, whispering words that shifted the air. The judge's expression tightened, confusion flickering before vanishing behind discipline. A recess was declared, not for exhaustion, but for preparation. The gallery murmured like restless bees, papers shuffled, watches checked. The girl returned to her seat, pendant clutched like armor. Her father leaned forward, face tight with worry, debt weighing heavier than relief. The room's laughter hung like stale smoke, but the sudden pause carried tension thicker than silence. The wealthy whispered among themselves, trading theories. The poor simply waited. 10 minutes stretched like rope pulled taut, promising either further humiliation or sudden vindication. Dust floated in sunlight, indifferent to the suspense. Somewhere beyond the doors, footsteps prepared to rewrite certainty. The laughter still echoed, but the echo had met its limit. Something was coming. The courtroom doors swung open with precision, and silence struck sharper than any gavel. Boots pressed against polished floor in synchronized rhythm, each step swallowing the last remnants of mockery. At the center walked a woman in uniform, metals catching light with ruthless clarity. Behind her marched 6 operators, men and women alike, their formation flawless. The gallery froze, their smirks evaporating, faces drained of certainty. The judge, once armored in arrogance, rose without thought, his body saluting before his pride could resist. Wealth and power trembled before proof made flesh. The poor child's humiliation was burned away in a march measured by discipline, by sacrifice, by scars unseen. Every eye in the room followed the unit, but every heart returned to the girl, whose impossible truth had just become undeniable. Silence was no longer absence. It was reverence, enforced by boots.
When the operators reached the front, they formed a living wall behind the child. Their stance was precise, their eyes unblinking, each body a shield of testimony no lawyer could cross-examine. The mother stopped at exact distance from the bench, posture carved from years of discipline. The room no longer belonged to wealth or tradition. It belonged to those who had carried silence through fire and returned with scars. Behind the girl stood proof no gavel could deny. The pendant at her neck and the salute in the air were two parts of the same story, a secret kept, a truth revealed. The humiliation that had consumed her minutes before now reversed, folding back onto the judge, the lawyers, and the gallery. Their disbelief was not only shattered, it was exposed as arrogance dressed in robes and polished shoes. Phones that once recorded laughter now captured silence, lenses quivering in hands that knew history had shifted. Clips of smirks were already uploaded, but what followed, the march, the salute, the impossible made visible, spread faster. Screens glowed outside the courthouse, whispers turned into posts, posts into outrage. The judge's certainty was now public humiliation, carried into feeds that rarely remembered nuance. Donors and colleagues saw not wisdom, but arrogance stripped bare. In coffee shops and living rooms, people replayed the smirk that turned into shock, looping it for satisfaction. The child's thrift sweater became an icon, her pendant a symbol of faith unshaken. For the wealthy, it was a scandal. For the poor, it was proof that even in marble halls built for exclusion, truth could arrive uninvited and rewrite the script. Humiliation was no longer private, it had been broadcast for the world's entertainment.
In chambers heavy with both law and memory, sealed files opened under fluorescent lights. The judge adjusted his glasses, each page forcing him further into humility. Dates, operations, training cycles, scars written into official language. Proof carried weight heavier than medals pinned to his chest. Every line contradicted his public certainty. Every stamped seal silenced years of tradition. His gavel had once felt like finality. Now it felt like theater compared to the ink before him. Across the room sat the girl, quiet but unyielding, her thrift sweater brighter than the plaques on the wall. The judge's certainty, once armored in decades of service, now cracked under the realization that his arrogance had mocked a truth stronger than his pride. The humiliation was no longer about a child's claim. It was about his blindness in a world where proof had always been within reach. The courtroom reconvened, but it was no longer the same room. The judge's tone, once laced with dismissal, now bent under the weight of contrition. He addressed the child directly, acknowledging that her truth had been mocked, her dignity dismissed, her courage overlooked. The apology echoed through the chamber, heavy not only because it was rare, but because it was public. Humiliation, once hers, now shifted fully to him. The gallery's silence was no longer disbelief, but judgment, their stares sharp as verdicts. To apologize in robes was to admit fallibility, and fallibility cost more than pride. It cost reputation, influence, legacy. The child sat still, pendant in hand, but her eyes burned with something larger than vindication. The apology was not only to her, but to every unseen truth laughed away in rooms built for power. His words stained the record like permanent ink.
Beyond humiliation, there remained the quiet tally of years lost. In the father's hands lay memories priced in sacrifice. Rent paid instead of birthday cakes. bus fares instead of gifts, medical bills instead of vacations. Absence was not abstract. It was recorded in notebooks, receipts, and overdraft notices. Each moment the mother served was a moment the father carried alone, and the child grew with only half the comfort she deserved. Service had cost not only the soldier, but the family left to explain silence. In the courtroom, the ledger of absence weighed heavier than metals. Poverty had filled the gaps left by duty, and now truth forced everyone to look at the imbalance. Vindication did not erase those years, it only reframed them. Absence had been endured. Absence had been excused. Now it was finally exposed for what it was, an unpaid debt. That evening, Judge Worthing attended a dinner among his donor circle. Once, he had been greeted with deference, his military past and judicial authority a crown. But whispers shifted, laughter redirected toward him. His earlier arrogance had not only been exposed, but replayed endlessly on screens his peers could not ignore. A man who mocked a child was now mocked himself, his certainty ridiculed as ignorance. His apology was dissected as weakness, his judgment as flawed. He returned home not to applause, but to silence, the kind that gnaws at reputation until it becomes scar tissue. Alone in his study, he stared at his medals. Once symbols of service, now they reflected failure, not of battlefields, but of compassion. Humiliation, when carried into donor halls, was more corrosive than scandal. He would sign papers in the morning that stripped his power of arrogance forever.
The operators who had marched with the mother carried traditions unknown to most. Among them was the challenge coin, a token not of wealth, but of sacrifice shared. One such coin passed from hand to hand until it reached the girl. Small, metallic, inscribed with symbols outsiders would never understand, it carried more authority than any gavel. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight. It was recognition of faith kept when disbelief was easier. It was proof that silence could protect rather than suffocate. Poverty had denied her toys, but now she carried something priceless. The coin gleamed faintly under dim light, a silent promise that she had not only been believed, but honored. For the first time, humiliation transformed into pride, a pride forged not from wealth, but from scars shared and sacrifices endured by those who understood secrecy. The family returned to their modest row house, walls painted with cracks, filled over the years by careful hands. The smell of radiator dust mixed with the faint sweetness of reheated leftovers. The house bore scars of poverty, but also resilience. Handwritten notes on the fridge, a crooked bookshelf filled with secondhand novels, a patched couch, sagging but reliable. Here, there were no polished floors or chandeliers, only floors scuffed by school shoes and walls covered in drawings taped proudly. Yet even here, absence was visible. An empty chair at the table, untouched boxes of photographs stacked in corners, spaces once waiting for someone who rarely arrived. The return was not triumphant, but fragile. Home was no longer simply shelter. It was a battlefield where love had been tested, where poverty had both shielded and scarred. Now, it waited to see if presence could heal.
From beneath her bed, the child retrieved a wooden box, worn at the edges, hinges squeaking with every motion. Inside lay artifacts of absence, report cards never shown, competition medals won without an audience, drawings folded and kept when no parent was there to praise them. Each item was a proof of life lived despite silence, a record that poverty had preserved with stubborn care. She placed the box on the table between them, and the mother sifted through each piece, eyes drawn to what she had missed. Proofs cut sharper than accusations. They were not arguments shouted in court, but fragments of moments gone forever.
Poverty had cataloged absence more faithfully than memory, saving every slip of paper as evidence. Now the weight of those memories pressed against medals and mission reports, forcing silence into confrontation at last. The following morning carried no marble or mahogany, only the smell of burnt batter in a cramped kitchen. The mother, once flawless in uniform, stumbled over frying pans and spilled syrup, learning a different kind of discipline. The child laughed, not cruelly but with relief, watching someone who once seemed untouchable fail at something ordinary. In that laughter, a new protocol was born. If absence returned, there would be notes left, voice messages recorded, rituals that promised presence even in delay. They wrote these down on an index card, the child titling it Home SOP 001. It was signed with solemnity, not by rank, but by love. For the first time, the kitchen held not just food, but trust. Pancakes became proof that perfection was unnecessary, that humility could build where authority once fractured. Poverty taught survival. Presence was now teaching repair. At school, whispers followed the child. Clips of the courtroom had traveled faster than assignments, classmates repeating what their parents had seen. Some whispered admiration, others disbelief muted into jealousy. Teachers watched her with new eyes, some respectful, others cautious. The counselor, trained to temper expectations, suggested realism in future goals, veiled doubt under professional tone. Yet, the child walked straighter, the coin in her pocket clinking softly against every step. Poverty still trailed her in frayed shoelaces and hand-me-down books, but the echo of humiliation had shifted into respect. For once, laughter did not greet her claims. It followed her in silence, heavier, sharper, but transformed into awe. She no longer needed to explain. Proof had entered her life in uniforms and medals, and humiliation had been rebranded as resilience, carried openly on school grounds. One night, the father rejected a lucrative rideshare fare, choosing instead to be present at a late recital. The decision meant groceries thinner, bills heavier, but absence had already cost too much. He stood in the back of the hall exhausted from hours behind a wheel. But when his daughter's eyes scanned the room, he was there. His presence was quiet, unnoticed by most, but to her, it was monumental. Humiliation had followed him for years, declined cards at gas stations, neighbors whispering about debts, borrowed suits judged in court. Yet his sacrifice, invisible to wealth, became visible in his daughter's relief. Poverty had taken much, but it had never taken his determination to show up. That night, humiliation turned into pride, measured not in applause or medals, but in a small smile exchanged across a crowded hall.
Days later, Judge Worthing signed an order mandating fee waivers for indigent litigants, a move more symbolic than systemic, but costly to his reputation among peers. The pen trembled in his hand, not from uncertainty, but from recognition that humiliation demanded restitution. For years, he had viewed poverty as inconvenience, a backdrop to the law rather than a defining factor. Now, his own arrogance had become a cautionary tale replayed endlessly online. Signing the order was less about reform and more about survival. But for those waiting in long courthouse lines with pockets empty, it was a small shift. A new sign was hung at a legal aid clinic. Fee waived. No one knew the full story behind it, but whispers said it had been born from a judge's mistake, from laughter that turned into silence, from a child's impossible truth. At night, the mother sat outside her daughter's room, not in uniform, but in worn clothes softened by years of absence. Her posture, once parade rest, softened into vigilance redefined. She listened to breaths steady into sleep, her presence quiet but undeniable. For years, she had guarded secrets no one could know. Now she guarded a doorway with equal intensity. Humiliation had once been her daughter's burden, disbelief her constant companion. Now vigilance shifted to protection visible and ordinary. No medals were penned, no reports filed, but this was a mission just as critical. Poverty still echoed in creaking floors and thin walls, but presence drowned it out. The child slept, coin under pillow, compass on her chest. For the first time in years, absence was not feared. Presence was practiced nightly, a ritual stronger than any protocol of war.
The coin in the child's hand became more than a symbol. It was validation that belief had weight, even when unsupported. She turned it over under sunlight, tracing grooves with care. In classrooms, in quiet corners, she touched it not to remember humiliation, but to remember triumph. Poverty still shadowed her, but belief was no longer fragile. It had been honored, confirmed, and celebrated by those who carried scars like armor. For the wealthy, coins were trivial tokens exchanged at clubs. For her, this coin outweighed cufflinks and gavels combined. It was proof that she had never lied, never invented stories for comfort. Belief, once dismissed, now reshaped her entire world. Every time the coin caught light, it reminded her that even laughter could not erase conviction. Belief had been tested, mocked, and humiliated, but in the end, it endured. The neighborhood, once indifferent to the family's struggles, shifted in subtle ways. Neighbors greeted them with nods, carrying recognition rather than pity. Children pointed discreetly at the girl, whispering about the clip they had seen online. Some still questioned, some still mocked quietly, but the balance had tipped. Poverty had made them invisible. Humiliation had made them unforgettable. The row house, with its peeling paint and crooked porch swing, became a landmark whispered about as the place where truth triumphed. For the first time, the family walked through the community with heads lifted, their poverty no less visible, but their dignity undeniable. Humiliation had once been a shadow. Now it had been repurposed into a torch that illuminated resilience. The community, too, began to see itself differently, less as victims of neglect, more as witnesses to strength carried by one of their own.
Judge Worthing, once celebrated in marble halls and polished clubs, found himself eating alone. Conversations dimmed when he entered, whispers replacing greetings. The clip of his smirk before the reveal played endlessly, eroding decades of respect in seconds. At his desk, medals still gleamed, but they mocked him now, reflecting his downfall more than his service. His apology, though public, did not erase the stain of arrogance. He had been humiliated not by superior officers or political rivals, but by a child in a thrift sweater. Alone in his study, he realized humiliation did not end in court. It followed into every room where his name once carried weight. Reputation, like glass, had shattered in an instant. He would rebuild, but never fully. The humiliation he delivered had returned with interest, and he was its permanent debtor. Trust did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in fragments: a school pickup not missed, a dinner shared without interruption, a promise kept with precision. The child watched her mother carefully, testing every word against action, every action against memory. Slowly, suspicion softened. The coin under her pillow clinked less from nervous checks and more from casual habit. Trust was not rebuilt with medals or apologies, but with consistency, repeated until disbelief had no space to grow. Poverty had taught caution. Now presence taught hope. Each small act was heavier than any courtroom victory. Trust became the currency they traded daily, fragile but accumulating. Humiliation had once fractured their bond, but repair came not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments. Slowly, steadily, trust rewrote the story that absence had dictated for years. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life settled into something new. Poverty still loomed, bills stacked, groceries stretched, but it no longer dictated every moment. The mother's presence, though imperfect, steadied the home. The father's sacrifices remained, but now they were shared, not endured alone. Humiliation had carved scars that would never fully vanish, but those scars glowed now with resilience. Victory was fragile, easily threatened by circumstance, but it existed. Courtrooms and donors no longer defined them. Laughter had been silenced by proof, arrogance humbled by reality. The family's victory was not loud or celebrated with parades. It was fragile, lived in quiet breakfasts, shared chores, and homework spread across tables. Fragile victories mattered. They were proof that humiliation could be survived, endured, and transformed into something heavier than pride. The courage to rebuild with whatever fragments remained. On the courthouse steps weeks later, the family walked together, hands joined. Behind them rose the building that once amplified laughter, now standing as a monument to its own shame. Ahead lay their modest row house, its crooked porch swing and peeling paint, waiting not as reminders of scarcity, but as symbols of survival. The child reached out, grasping both her parents' hands at once, bridging years of absence with a gesture simple yet monumental. Poverty remained, but so did resilience. Humiliation lingered, but now as memory, not destiny. The door to their home creaked but did not close. It stayed open, waiting for footsteps that promised to return. For the first time in years, the future felt possible. Not perfect, not easy, but possible. And for a family forged in absence, laughter, and humiliation, possibility itself was the greatest redemption.